At her own mother's funeral, 8-year-old Ellie had her hair forcibly shaved by HOA chairwoman Karen Wheeler, all in the name of community rules. Karen showed no remorse, insisting she was just doing her duty, even as a grieving child stood humiliated. But Ellie's father, District Attorney John Sutton, had one rule of his own. No one harms his daughter and walks away unpunished. And just wait until you see how this shocking act turned into a powerful fight for justice. With a finale you won't forget. The church smelled like lilies and fear. A thick, cloying scent clung to the air, curling through the wooden pews, mixing with the faint must of old hymnals and the stifled sobs of grieving relatives. The casket, polished mahogany, sat under a soft spotlight near the altar, surrounded by white flower arrangements, and silence so heavy it made the pews creak louder than they should have. 8-year-old Ellie Sutton stood barely tall enough to see over the edge of her mother's coffin. She wore a simple black dress with a white collar, chosen carefully by her father the night before. Her hands clutched a small, wrinkled piece of notebook paper, creased and damp from the pressure of her fingers. Her hair had been brushed and braided into two tight pigtails, just the way her mother liked them. It had been her dying request. "Promise me you'll wear your hair in braids so I can see you look like yourself," Jenna had whispered to her in that final hospital bed. And Ellie had nodded through tears. Now she stood still, legs trembling, lips slightly parted as if every breath took more effort than the last. The church was filled with a sea of quiet bodies, classmates from school, neighbors, extended family, and several members of the local HOA board. Among them stood Karen Wheeler, president of the Homeowners Association, an iron-spined woman in her early 50s with a rigid gray bob and permanent squint lines etched between her brows. Her face was the kind of sharp that made people instinctively apologize when she entered a room, like walking past a cop with your hands in your pockets. She wore a beige power suit, even to a funeral, and clutched a brown leather bag like it held state secrets. As Ellie stepped forward to the microphone and cleared her throat, the room held its breath. She looked down at her crumpled paper, then up at the sea of eyes watching her, some red-rimmed, some blank, some just curious. Her voice shook as she began reading, "My mom was my best friend," and trailed off as emotion strangled the words in her throat. She blinked hard, swallowing, her small hands gripping the paper tighter. But Karen wasn't watching the speech. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moved. She was staring, no, glaring, at Ellie's braids. She leaned to one of the HOA board members and whispered something while nodding at the child. The man looked horrified, whispered something back, but Karen didn't flinch. She tightened her jaw and walked to the front with the posture of someone issuing a parking violation, not attending a funeral. The speech ended with Ellie whispering, "I love you, Mommy," into the microphone. She stepped back from the podium and turned toward the casket. Her shoulders heaved, and the room broke into a soft chorus of sniffles and low cries. And then Karen moved. She stepped forward, heels clicking on the stone floor, her expression cold and bureaucratic. She reached into her bag and pulled out, God help them, a battery-powered hair clipper. The buzzing sound echoed like a swarm of bees in a crypt. "Excuse me," she announced, her voice firm but falsely polite. According to Section 4B of the HOA bylaws, all public events within community jurisdiction must comply with grooming standards. Braids of that type are specifically prohibited. Everyone froze. No one spoke. Not at first. "Ma'am, this is a funeral," someone whispered from the second row. Karen didn't stop. With horrifying calm, she knelt down in front of Ellie, who stared at her, wide-eyed and confused. "It's nothing personal, sweetheart," Karen said in a voice that had no business being used on a child. "But rules are rules." Before anyone could stop her, before a single adult in the room could cross the distance fast enough, Karen placed a firm hand on Ellie's shoulder. The buzzing machine touched the side of Ellie's head. Screams erupted. A woman shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" Too late, Karen pressed the clippers forward. A thick lock of golden hair tumbled to the stone floor like a fallen ribbon. Ellie didn't cry. She didn't scream. She froze, her mouth parted slightly, her body stiff as porcelain. Her little chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. By the time someone yanked Karen away, the damage was done. Ellie stood there in front of her mother's casket, with a jagged line shaved across the side of her head. Silence swept the church again. Only this time, it was darker, heavier, violent. And John Sutton, the child's father, stood up slowly from the front pew. His face was blank, not calm, not angry, just blank. The kind of blank that comes before a storm. No one moved, no one spoke. The buzzing of the clippers had stopped, but its echo still lingered in the vaulted ceiling like an accusation. For a few impossible seconds, time didn't just slow, it seemed to collapse in on itself. Ellie stood completely still, her arms limp at her sides as tufts of her pale hair fluttered down around her shoes. Soft curls stuck to the shoulders of her dress, clinging like broken petals. She didn't cry. She didn't blink. Her face was blank, wide, unblinking eyes locked on the casket in front of her, as if trying to make sense of what her brain couldn't yet process. Her bottom lip trembled once, then stopped. Even her breath was shallow, as though she feared breathing too loud would shatter her last bit of control. John Sutton, her father, watched in paralyzed disbelief. He had risen halfway from the pew when the machine had touched her scalp but froze, his mind incapable of fully accepting what he was seeing. John, the man who had stood unshaken in murder trials, who had argued federal cases without a tremor in his voice, now stood motionless, every instinct screaming but none acting. He had seen cruelty in his life, but this was something else, something obscene, something so divorced from reason that his mind momentarily shut down in self-defense. Then came the voice, flat, bureaucratic, unrepentant. "I was only enforcing the rules," Karen Wheeler said, lowering the buzzing clippers into her handbag like it was no more than a clipboard. Her tone was calm, mechanical, as though she had just completed a scheduled inspection of the neighborhood lawns. "The gathering falls under HOA jurisdiction. The cemetery is within our community boundary and thus subject to public appearance guidelines." Her voice, strangely clear, cut through the stunned hush like a bone saw. Children attending community events must comply with standards. Excessively styled or distracting hair is a violation of subsection 3.4. It's right there in the governing documents. She actually believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't angry. She wasn't acting out of vengeance or spite. No, Karen spoke like someone reciting a policy memo, like a woman so buried in rules that she had forgotten what human beings were. There was no remorse in her eyes, only irritation that no one was thanking her for her diligence. A choked sound rose from the front pew. The elderly aunt of the deceased, a frail woman in lavender gloves, let out a soft moan and fainted where she sat. Two cousins rushed to catch her before she hit the ground. The pastor dropped his Bible onto the pulpit with a hollow thud. He was staring at Karen as though she had just torn a page out of the 10 Commandments. Somewhere behind the crowd, a phone was dialing 911. A woman shouted, "Get her out of here!" But no one moved toward Karen. No one dared. John finally did. He stepped forward, slow and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal or a live grenade. His voice cracked when he said her name. "Ellie." She didn't respond. Her eyes were still locked on the casket. Her lips were parted just enough to show her teeth, like she was about to speak, but nothing came out. He dropped to his knees beside her, gently cupping the back of her head, then wrapping his arms around her trembling frame. He pulled her into his chest, holding her like she was the last fragile thing in a world gone violently insane. She didn't hug him back. She just stared straight ahead, her breathing shallow, as a quiet wheeze escaped her throat. Like fear was pressing down so hard on her lungs, she could barely inhale. Karen stood a few feet away, watching like she had done a necessary job and was now waiting for a thank you. Her posture remained straight. Her chin was high. The buzzing clipper, still warm, was back in her bag. "You're all being emotional," she said. "It's just hair." Then she turned. She adjusted the strap of her purse, glanced at the silent faces around her, each one stunned, each one frozen, and walked calmly down the aisle like she'd just delivered a casserole to a potluck. Her heels echoed off the marble floor. She didn't apologize. She didn't look back. She just left. Ellie's shredded braids still lay on the stone floor like the remains of something sacred, and John Sutton, district attorney, legal giant, father, sat there on the floor of the church, arms wrapped around his daughter, no words left in his throat. The storm hadn't come yet, but it was already forming. John Sutton didn't go to work the next morning. He didn't call in. He didn't send a text. He didn't answer the phone, not when his assistant tried to reach him, not when a judge called, asking about a postponed motion. He didn't care. He just sat in his home office with the doors shut and the blinds drawn, wrapped in the gray static of his own breath. The documents were spread out on the desk like a dissected corpse. HOA bylaws, meeting transcripts, policy packets, complaint forms. All of it laid out like an autopsy of common sense. And in the center, his laptop. The screen played a muted video on repeat. The funeral, the braids, the buzz. He'd watched it 12 times, then 13, then 14. Each time his jaw clenched tighter. Each time his grip on the armrests stiffened. It didn't get easier. It didn't get dull. There was no desensitization, just the same nauseating jolt every time that machine touched his daughter's head, and she didn't move, didn't cry, just stared hollow, robbed of more than hair. In the hallway, silence. Ellie hadn't spoken since the incident. Not one word. She hadn't eaten either. The plate of scrambled eggs he left outside her bedroom door that morning still sat untouched. The water hadn't been sipped. Her nightlight was still on from the night before, even in full daylight. He had knocked once, then twice. She'd answered the second time with the faintest voice, asking only one thing. "Can you braid my hair again?" He'd stood there for a full minute, unable to speak, fingers pressed against the doorframe, because there was nothing left to braid. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced. He stared out windows. He read every line in the HOA manual, highlighting every passage Karen Wheeler had used to justify what she'd done. He knew what she would say. She would lean on policy, on precedent, on community standards. But there was no policy for cruelty, no clause that excused humiliating a grieving child, no subsection for malice disguised as order. On the third morning, something shifted. He didn't shave, didn't change his shirt. He didn't even check the mirror. He just picked up the folder he had prepared, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. His movements were slow but exact, like a man following a blueprint for something that had been built long ago, only now realizing it was a weapon. At 9:07 a.m., John Sutton walked into the district prosecutor's office. Heads turned, no one spoke. His presence carried weight even on normal days, but today it was something else, something cold, focused, atomic. He walked straight past the receptionist, past the glass conference room, past the wide-eyed interns and the senior attorneys pretending to not watch. He reached the deputy DA's office, opened the door without knocking, and placed the folder on the desk. "I'm taking this case," he said. The deputy looked up, startled. "John, what case?" He didn't blink. "Karen Wheeler," he said, "chairwoman of the Glenridge HOA, for the incident at the cemetery." The deputy shifted in his seat. "I heard something happened, but, John, are you sure you should—" "I'm not just sure," John said, his voice low and unwavering. "I'm certain." He opened the folder. Inside were printouts of the HOA bylaws, statements from witnesses, screenshots from the funeral video. On top, a freshly written affidavit, signed by hand, time-stamped and notarized. "I'm not prosecuting her as a board member, not as a neighbor, not even as a lunatic who brought a hair clipper to a funeral." He leaned forward. "I'm prosecuting her as a criminal." The room was silent. Then John pulled a document from his inside coat pocket. It was a motion for a warrant, already drafted, already prepared. He signed it with a single stroke. "Let's begin." When Karen Wheeler received the subpoena, she actually laughed. Out loud. Alone in her kitchen, still wearing her morning robe, coffee cup in hand, she chuckled as if someone had just sent her a prank. She even called her friend from the HOA board, Marcy, and read it aloud on speakerphone, between snorts of disbelief. "They think they can sue me?" she scoffed. "For what? Enforcing community standards?" By noon, the laugh had vanished. She was dialing 911. She told the dispatcher she was being harassed by a government official, and when asked to clarify, she said, "Yes, the district attorney. He's targeting me personally." The dispatcher paused, then said, "Ma'am, you'll need to contact a lawyer." So she did. Karen called Gregory Nash, the longtime attorney for the HOA, a man who had once helped her fine a family for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of blue. She launched into a tirade, reciting bylaws and quoting section numbers, trying to wrap herself in legal fabric as armor. "I followed procedure to the letter," she insisted. "The funeral was held within the boundaries of Glenridge. That makes it a community event. Her hairstyle was a violation of grooming code." But this time, Nash didn't sound reassuring. He cleared his throat, said they needed to meet, in person. The following morning, Karen walked into his office in full defense mode, folder under one arm, pearls around her neck, and a stack of printed emails in hand. She was ready for war, but Nash wasn't looking at the bylaws. He was looking at the formal complaint sent from the district attorney's office: battery of a minor, intentional infliction of emotional distress, violation of bodily autonomy. And the big one: abuse of authority under color of administrative power. Her voice faltered for the first time. "This isn't civil?" "No," Nash said flatly. "It's criminal." Karen blinked. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, she seemed to shrink beneath her tailored blazer. "I was protecting the neighborhood," she muttered. But no one was buying it anymore. Behind the scenes, the case was already unfolding. John Sutton wasn't simply filing charges, he was building an entire record. With surgical precision, he opened every file connected to Karen's time as HOA chair. And what he found wasn't just troubling, it was a pattern. Petty fines levied without proper notice. Tenants pressured to leave after complaining about board favoritism. Single mothers ticketed for letting their children play too loudly. And then came the letters, the ones Karen had written herself, some hand-signed, some smug, some threatening legal action over untrimmed hedges or chalk drawings on sidewalks. They poured in, and with them came the witnesses. Former residents who moved out early just to escape her, seniors who'd been harassed over non-regulation wind chimes, one woman who'd been reported for leaving a pumpkin on her porch past Halloween. Karen hadn't just been a tyrant, she'd been meticulous about it, but none of those acts had brought her down, until Ellie, until she walked into a funeral with a battery-powered clipper and shaved a grieving child's head in front of a casket. That was the line, the undeniable proof of something darker than overreach. It was cruelty, caught on camera, broadcast in whispers across the community. Karen still tried to hold ground. She attended the next HOA meeting as if nothing had happened, sat straight-backed at the table, trying to gavel the room into silence. But no one listened. They stared at her like a stranger, a ticking clock. By then, Sutton had already filed motions to unseal prior complaints. Depositions had begun. Former board members were being interviewed. Every abuse she had buried in paperwork was surfacing, one page at a time. And Karen Wheeler, once the self-declared guardian of neighborhood order, finally began to understand this wasn't about braids. This was about power, and now someone was holding her accountable for every inch of it. Karen Wheeler entered the courtroom like a woman stepping onto a debate stage, not into a criminal trial. Her posture was sharp, her chin elevated, her expression rehearsed. She wore a charcoal gray pantsuit and a pearl necklace, as if dressing in authority could summon it back. From the moment she sat down at the defense table, she smirked, whispered sarcastically to her attorney, rolled her eyes during the reading of the charges. When the bailiff called the courtroom to order, Karen crossed her arms. When the clerk read "battery of a minor," she raised her eyebrows theatrically. When the prosecutor stood to begin opening statements, she actually chuckled. "They're trying to destroy me over hair," she muttered, loud enough for the second row to hear. She interrupted testimony, sighed dramatically. At one point, she stood up and accused the court of conducting a witch hunt. Her voice rang through the chamber, sharp, shrill, unrepentant. "I was enforcing regulations," she snapped. "I was following the rules, rules that this entire neighborhood agreed to. Now I'm being punished for doing my job?" Judge Hampton, a woman known for her steel demeanor and intolerance for grandstanding, let her finish. Then, without emotion, she glanced at the prosecutor. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "proceed with the video." That's when everything changed. The lights dimmed. A large screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The room went still, No creaking chairs, no coughs, no murmurs. And then it played. The funeral. The altar. The tiny girl in black, barely taller than the podium, her voice cracking as she read. The camera's angle shifted as Karen stepped into frame. She moved without hesitation, like a meter maid approaching an illegally parked car. The bag, the clippers, the buzzing sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and then contact. The child didn't scream. She just stood there as her braids fell like rope, severed from the roots. The video didn't need commentary. The image said more than any law ever could. In the courtroom, no one moved. Someone gasped. Someone else quietly began to cry. A tissue rustled. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer, tilted his head down and closed his eyes. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. Karen didn't speak. Her lips were parted, but no sound came out. Her smirk had disappeared. Her jaw trembled slightly, as if her brain was scrambling for language, justification, rebuttal, anything. But the silence around her swallowed every word before it could form. John Sutton stood. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pointed to the screen and said clearly, slowly, each syllable sharp as glass. This was not a policy decision. He let the words hang in the air. This was not an interpretation of bylaws. This was not regulation. This was not order. He turned toward the jury. This was barbarism. A long pause, then one last sentence. And now, society answers. He sat. No rebuttal came. Karen sank a little lower in her chair. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. Her shoulders hunched, not in defiance, but in something that looked dangerously close to realization. The judge looked over the bench. The screen was dark now, but the image of it, the child, the clippers, the grave, had already burned itself into every pair of eyes in that room, and justice had just begun to speak. Karen snapped. She lunged for the microphone, voice shaking with rage. That girl was being disobedient. It's just hair. It grows back. Her words echoed through the courtroom. I'm the one being harassed. I followed the rules. I protected the neighborhood. The judge didn't stop her. Karen's voice cracked. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I was just doing my job. But it didn't matter. The jury had already decided. 7 charges, 7 guilty verdicts. Karen froze. She looked around the room like she'd woken from a dream and couldn't remember where she was. The judge read the sentence. 2 years probation, mandatory therapy, permanent ban from administrative roles, and most of all, a public apology to Ellie Sutton. Karen tried to speak, but nothing came out. Justice didn't need her words. It already had her silence. The next day, the church looked almost identical. Same brick steps, same courtyard, same breeze rustling through the lilies by the door. But this time, there was no funeral, no crowd, no sobbing relatives, just 3 people standing beneath the archway. John Sutton, his daughter Ellie, and the woman who had once claimed authority over them both. Karen Wheeler stood at the podium with a single sheet of paper in her trembling hands. Her hair, once immaculately styled, now hung flat against her temples. She wore no makeup. Her suit was wrinkled at the elbows, the fabric around her shoulders loose like she hadn't eaten in days. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red. She looked at the small girl seated in the front pew, then quickly down at the page. The judge had made it clear. This apology was not a legal formality. It was part of her sentence, yes, but it had to be delivered with sincerity, in the exact place where the harm had occurred, not in a courtroom, not through a statement. But here, Karen swallowed. I would like to apologize to Ellie Sutton, she began, voice barely audible. What I did to you was cruel, unjust, and something no child should ever endure. Her fingers gripped the paper harder, knuckles whitening. I caused pain that cannot be undone. I acted not with care or concern, but with arrogance. I see that now, and I am sorry. Ellie sat still. Karen's voice shook. I let rules become more important than people. I let control replace compassion, and in doing so, I deeply hurt a young girl who had already lost more than anyone her age should. Her eyes lifted briefly toward Ellie, then back down. I never should have been near that podium. I never should have raised my hand against you, and I will never... She stopped, not because she lost her place, but because Ellie had stood up. The girl walked slowly toward the platform, not afraid, not angry, just quiet. Her shoes tapped gently against the stone floor. She reached the bottom step and looked up at the woman who had once humiliated her in front of the world. Karen's lips parted. Her body trembled. The apology, unfinished, shook in her hands like something about to collapse. Ellie said nothing for a long moment. Then calmly, she spoke. "You don't need to say anything else." Karen blinked, confused. Ellie looked her directly in the eye. "Just stay away from us." There was no hate in her voice, no cruelty, just quiet certainty, the kind of line drawn not in anger but in survival. She turned and walked back to her father. John didn't say a word. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and together they walked out of the church, step by step, out into the daylight, leaving Karen standing alone behind the microphone with nothing left to read. And for once, Karen didn't speak. 1 month later, the Glenridge HOA was dissolved. Quietly, at first, an emergency vote, a boardroom emptied of allies, a resignation letter no one bothered to read aloud, then publicly. The signs were taken down, the bylaws removed from the website, the property management firm cut ties, a new community committee was formed, one that banned discriminatory language, revoked punitive appearance clauses, and struck down every fine issued without due process. Residents who had once lived in quiet fear now stood on their porches, smiling again. Wind chimes dancing freely in the breeze, chalk drawings reappearing on sidewalks like confetti after a storm. The old HOA had become a ghost, a cautionary tale. Karen Wheeler tried to fight it. She sent letters, she threatened lawsuits, but no one read them, no one responded. When she returned home from a brief stay with family, she found her belongings stacked neatly on her porch. A printed notice was taped to the door. Unit no longer under HOA jurisdiction. Civil protections no longer valid. We wish you peace elsewhere. She didn't move in. She didn't say goodbye. No one saw her leave, and no one asked where she went. Meanwhile, Ellie Sutton had begun to heal. Not all at once, not easily, but slowly, like light returning to a room you forgot had windows. She met weekly with a child therapist, someone gentle and patient, who never asked too many questions too quickly. They talked about small things first, school lunches, math quizzes, the way rain sounds on the roof. Eventually, the subject shifted. Grief came in waves. And so did trust. John sat outside the office during every session, sometimes staring at the same sentence in a book for an hour, sometimes holding a stuffed rabbit Ellie had once brought for comfort and forgotten to take back. And then, one Saturday morning, the house was unusually quiet. John called her name, but Ellie didn't answer. Her bedroom door was ajar, so was the bathroom light. He stepped into the hallway, half worried, half expecting to find her brushing her teeth or sitting cross-legged on the floor reading. But she was standing at the mirror, still, focused, hands at her sides. 2 small braids hung neatly from either side of her head, delicate, uneven, just long enough to rest on her shoulders. Her new hair had grown in soft and wild, a little wavy near the ends, a little stubborn at the crown, but she had braided it herself, carefully, quietly, without saying a word. John froze in the doorway, his throat closed, his knees nearly gave. And then, tears. Not sharp, broken sobs like at the funeral, but slow, grateful tears. The kind that don't demand answers, only presence. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her, and she met his gaze in the mirror. No smile, just quiet strength. It was the first time since the burial that he saw his daughter in full. The girl who had stood through humiliation, silence, and grief, and still braided her own hair. As for Karen Wheeler, she faded into absence. Her name was no longer printed on plaques or whispered at board meetings, but in the neighborhood, her story endured, not as a headline or a court record, but as a warning. Her name was passed quietly between neighbors, spoken only when someone asked why rules now came with empathy, why children were never scolded for chalk drawings, why no one touched another person's child without permission. Karen Wheeler had become a ghost. a name people said only in whispers, not in reverence, but to remember what not to become.